if the king walks in the door of my life, if you will, and I know he's the king, and I accept him as my king, then I'm not only amenable to his command, I think I'm amenable to his suggestion or his look or whatever it is. There's this profound thing that you find in both the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it's this pivotal thought. I mean, here are people who are steeped, the Jewish people, Hebrew people, steeped in religious regulation, sacrificial systems, laws. I think it's 613 laws that you find, hygienic and otherwise, civic. But at the heart of that, it's distilled into these words. You shall have no other gods before me, but you shall love the Lord your God with all your whole heart, soul, mind, spirit. And so, I mean, it's said in a variety of similar but slightly different ways in the New Testament. You shall love the Lord your God with all your being, I'll just sum it up, and love your neighbor as yourself. I was brought up, that's the great commandment, what we call the great commandment. I was brought up on with a strong emphasis on what we call the Great Commission. And the Great Commission is what Jesus said at the end of his earthly life before he left. And that was go into all the world and teach the things I've taught you, the things I've taught you to observe, preach and baptize and so forth. And I'm doing that just as a paraphrase. And that kind of mission, that kind of observable, tabulatable, I don't even know if that's a word, you can count it, mission, and how many people came to Jesus, how many preaching points established, how many hospitals have been built, so forth. That's more tangible in some ways than you shall love the Lord your God with your whole being. Oswald Chambers, a fellow who died at the age of 43, he was a Scot, and he went to the University of Edinburgh as an artist back in the day, and really came to faith at a little Baptist church, I think someplace in Edinburgh, moved across the country, which isn't very far because Scotland's not that big a place, to a little Bible school in Dunoon, Scotland. And there he started theological training and met his soon-to-be wife, who had been trained as a court stenographer. When they married, they moved to London, started a little Bible school there, where most of the teaching, apparently, was done around meal times, which really is sort of a biblical concept, the idea of rabbinic table fellowship and all of that. And when World War I started, he joined up, not as a military officer, but as a chaplain through, I think it was the YMCA that was serving, I don't know if they were on contract or what they were, with the British Army. Long story short, he died in Cairo in 1917 of a burst appendix because he didn't want to take another soldier's bed, and so he waited too long and he died of that. He was 43 years old. His wife came and took his talks, like what I'm doing now, took his talks and put them into a little booklet some years later that many of us know as the devotional My Utmost for His Highest. And in his biography, written by a fellow named David McCaslin, there's an exchange that goes on where people are asking him questions. He said, that my mission in life is to love the Lord my God with my whole being and love my neighbor as myself. So what I would call the Great Commission sort of comes on the backstroke. This is the driver, this is the result. And his comment was, what man considers the process, I'll love God, quote, so I can win the world for Jesus. What man considers the process, God considers the goal. The goal of my life in the King's house and in the King's presence is to know the King better, is to absorb the King in my life. And these other things happened, as a friend would say, on the backstroke. And by that, I'm saying, we say I'm in missions work, let's say. And missions work, it's usually institutional things, which is great. It's church planting, it's starting this orphanage or that thing someplace in the world. And these are wonderful enterprises and needful. Anti-sex trafficking work, all of these things that have our cultures in bondage in a lot of ways. But what is being said there is that that's not the work. And I already said this in this series, that's not the work. Believing is the work. Trusting that King, trusting that God. That's the goal. That's the mission. This is a subset of that mission. When I was a 17-year-old, I had a guy that I sort of idolized. He was brilliant, and he was a year older than I. And when you're a teenager, 1 year makes a big difference. At least in my mind, it made a big difference. And I started hanging out with him, and pretty soon my mannerisms became like his mannerisms, just in that year. And so that, for me, when I think of the mission of God in the world, the narrative of God in the world, is to love God with our whole being. And that's not just because I read scripture or that I pray, it's because I hang out with people who also love Him, and they can teach me things and they can show me things. And I've been greatly privileged in my pursuit of God, even when I wasn't pursuing Him very strongly, because He's always pursuing me.